Good day, ECO231 students. We are in week 9 and we will be doing chapter 9 this week. It deals with the analysis of competitive markets. Now, take note that you will be completing sections 9.1, 9.2, and 9.3. Sections 9.4 to 9.6 are not prescribed for the second year microeconomics. You would do that in your third year. Now, let's do a quick recap of what you have covered thus far. So, you started with your basic introduction in chapter 1, then you moved on to chapter 2 that dealt with your revision of supply and demand analysis. Then we looked at chapters 3 to 8, excluding chapter 5, and that dealt with consumers, producers, and competitive markets. And you were shown how your demand and supply curves are in fact derived. Now, in this chapter, you are going to use your supply and demand analysis to try to explain some economic problems and the impacts that government policy, such as your minimum and maximum prices, quotas, tariffs, taxes, and subsidies, you are going to try to evaluate the impacts of those types of government policies and try to explain certain economic problems using your demand and supply analysis. Now, we refer to the effects of government policy as welfare effects because ultimately we are affected, consumers are affected, producers are affected, the welfare thereof. So there are those who are going to be the gainers, and others are going to lose out from those policies. So this chapter is going to show you how to use those tools, and ultimately you're going to have to calculate what those effects are. And this is going to become important for your ECO 231 exam. So for second year, remember we are only going to work up to section 9.3. So do you remember from first year and your second year revision of chapter 2, you dealt with price ceilings and price floors. That was just a quick recap. Now, a price ceiling, is a maximum price that is set below the market price. And very often, the intention thereof is to assist consumers. So, for instance, you could have a price ceiling on the price of bread because you want to assist consumers. But ultimately, it's going to result in a market shortage because at this low price, the quantity demanded would increase, but producers wouldn't want to supply so much at that particular price. So some consumers gain, there will be others that lose out because they don't get the good at all, and producers lose out on the whole, right? So is it better to have a policy such as this? And in the past, in South Africa, there have been instances where price ceilings have been applied. Then there's also your price floors. Now, your price floor is a minimum price, and this helps producers on the other hand. And very often, this is used in agriculture, for instance. The minimum wage is an example. So it then results in a market surplus or an excess supply because quantity supplied would increase, but at this higher price, quantity demanded would fall. So there's this market surplus that arises. And again, there's going to be gains to your producers and losses to consumers. And what is the net effect of this type of policy? Right? So this is what we are going to try to deal with by looking at welfare effects. You are going to have to calculate the changes in consumer surplus and producer surplus to see the impact of these types of policies. So you may be required to do it in a graphical way, but also using calculations, as we'll see towards the end of the chapter. So now we'll do a quick review of consumer and producer surplus. Now you know that in competitive markets that has no government regulation, there would be many buyers and many sellers that could buy and sell a particular good, and that would occur at a market clearing price or the market price. Now, in this case, we are going to see that that market price is $5. So this is the market clearing price or equilibrium price, the market price, and this would be the quantity at that particular price. And I've determined that by the intersection of my market supply and market demand curves. We can see we've got our standard upward sloping market supply curve and downward sloping market demand curve in blue. So if you have a look at your demand curve reflects the consumer's willingness to pay. So what one consumer may be willing to pay, it may be more for a good than what another consumer may be willing to pay. So I may be willing to pay 90 Rand for a jar of Jacob's coffee, but someone else may only be willing to pay 75 Rand for that jar of Jacob's coffee. So the difference in what you are willing to pay versus the price that you actually pay, that is the consumer surplus. So the price that you are willing to pay is going to be reflected by this demand curve, and the price that you actually pay is given by the market price. So the difference here then becomes your consumer surplus. So if we have a look at this diagram, here a consumer A for instance, would be willing to pay $10 for a good. However, the market price is $5. So therefore, this consumer A is going to enjoy a benefit of $5, the difference between their willingness to pay versus what they actually pay. Then if we have a look at consumer B willingness to pay for this quantity would be $7. However, this consumer only pays $5. So therefore, the difference represents the benefit this consumer derives, and that is the consumer surplus for that consumer. And then lastly, consumer C's willingness to pay would be $5. But at the same time, that is the market price. So the consumer C values the good at exactly the market price, so therefore doesn't derive any particular benefit. So therefore, the consumer surplus measures the total benefit to all consumers, and this is this yellow shaded area between the demand curve and the market price. So now we can move on to producer surplus. Now, some producers can produce a unit of a good at a cost that is lower than the market price. So that would be given by the supply curve over here. So these producers, if they can produce a unit of a good at a cost that is lower than the market price, which was $5, that then represents some benefit or a surplus to them, because the difference between what they can get as a price, which is the $5, that is the market price, versus what they'd be willing to supply the good at, there's a difference between the two, and hence they can earn some producer surplus. So your producer surplus then measures the total profits to producers plus rents to factor inputs. Remember, the discussion around rents came up in chapter 8. So that is factored into your producer surplus. Now, in terms of looking at the benefit, it is the benefit that the lower cost producers enjoy by selling at the market price. But remember, they are lower cost producers. So therefore, the area that is shaded green, this area over here, that lies between the market price and the supply curve is going to represent your producer surplus. So the shaded green area is your producer surplus above your supply curve but below the market price. Now, if we take these two areas together, when you add the consumer and the producer surplus together, it measures the total surplus or the total welfare benefit in a competitive market. Now, remember, in this case, it's unhindered. There's no government intervention in any way, shape, or form with minimum prices, maximum prices, etc. Now that you have been reminded of how to determine your consumer and producer surplus, we can determine the welfare effects of government policy. So those policies like minimum, maximum prices, quotas, tariffs, although you won't deal with quotas and tariffs now. Now, welfare effects can be defined as the gains and the losses to consumers and producers. Now, let's quickly look at figure 9.2. Here we have our market supply and market demand curves. Market demand is your blue curve and your supply is the upward sloping red curve. And again, we've got price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. The equilibrium price, as you can see, is given by P0. That is where your market demand and market supply curves intersect. And then the quantity at this market clearing price of P0 would be Q0. So that would be the quantity. Now, when government sets a price ceiling or a maximum price, that is going to be given by this price P max. Remember, for a price ceiling or maximum price to be effective, it has to be below the market clearing price, right? So producers can't charge a price higher than P max. So at this price, you will see, because the price is lower than the market clearing price, you are going to find that the quantity demanded is going to increase from what it was at Q0 to Q2, right? So consumers would, of course, demand more at a lower price. However, the quantity supplied, because producers can't charge higher than Pmax, the quantity supplied has fallen from Q0 to Q1. So the quantity supplied is now at Q1. So given that, what you notice between Q2 and Q1, there is a market shortage or an excess demand, and it's given by the distance between Q1 and Q2. So now, because of this maximum price, production and sales are now at Q1. There are going to be consumers that are better off because they are getting this lower price, but then there are consumers that are forced out of the market because the quantity supplied is only Q1, so they lose out. So prior to this maximum price, the consumer surplus would have been this area. Right? Now you have this maximum price, and what you find is that block A is now transferred from producer surplus to consumer surplus, because these consumers now get the product at a lower price. However, output is only at Q1. So as a result of that, there are consumers that lose out completely, and that is represented by this triangle B. These consumers get nothing at all at this price P max. So the overall change to your consumer surplus is going to be A minus B. And because block A is greater than B, you will find that there's a net effect of a gain to consumer surplus. But you could have a situation where B is greater than A. For producers, before the maximum price, producer surplus was given by this triangle. Now with your P max, producer surplus is only going to be this little triangle. Producers lose this rectangle to consumers because they are getting a lower price than before. The other triangle C also represents a loss to producers because production is lower and some producers had to leave the market. Those that didn't leave because of having lower marginal cost are also losing that bit as a result of this lower price P max. So as a result, the total loss to produce a surplus is going to be minus A minus C.